It began with a simple, almost benign purchase. I was browsing through an antique store on a rainy afternoon when I stumbled upon a beautiful old mirror. It had an ornate gilded frame and an antique charm that caught my eye. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a warm smile, assured me it was a rare find from the early 1900s. She mentioned it had a history of being owned by several generations, each adding their own touch to its worn frame. I was enchanted by its intricate design and the way it seemed to reflect the dim light of the shop with an otherworldly glow. I bought the mirror on a whim, eager to add a touch of elegance to my otherwise modern apartment. It wasn't until I hung it on the wall of my bedroom that I started to notice something unsettling. The mirror, though beautiful, seemed to cast an oddly distorted reflection. The colors in the reflection were richer, more vivid, and the details in the room seemed slightly off. It was as though the mirror showed a version of reality that was subtly warped. The first night with the mirror was uneventful. I went to bed thinking nothing of the strange distortion in the glass. But as the days went by, the disturbances began. I started to notice that the reflection in the mirror didn't always match the room's actual appearance. Objects would appear slightly out of place, or shadows would seem to move on their own. It was subtle at first, a corner of the room that looked darker or a flicker of movement that didn't quite match reality. One evening, as I was preparing for bed, I caught a glimpse of something odd in the mirror. I saw a shadowy figure standing behind me, almost imperceptible, blending into the darkness of the reflection. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart raced, and I dismissed it as a trick of the light or my imagination. The next few nights, the shadows became more pronounced. I would see vague dark shapes moving in the mirror's reflection, even though nothing was out of place when I looked around. I tried to convince myself it was just the way the light played on the glass, but the unease continued to grow. The figure in the mirror seemed to take on a more defined shape, a gaunt, emaciated figure with hollow eyes that watched me with a malevolent gaze. One night, as I lay in bed trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread, I heard a faint whispering sound coming from the mirror. It was a soft, raspy murmur, as though someone or something was speaking just beyond the glass. I approached the mirror cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and the figure in the reflection seemed to reach out towards me with spectral hands. I backed away from the mirror, my mind racing with fear. I tried to cover the mirror with a cloth, but the whispering only grew more frantic. The next morning, I decided to take the mirror down and store it away, hoping that removing it from the room would end the disturbances. But when I attempted to move it, I found it impossible to lift. It was as though the mirror had become anchored to the wall, defying my efforts to remove it. The mirror continued to torment me. The shadowy figure became more defined and more menacing, and the whispering grew louder each night. It was as if the mirror was alive, a conduit for something dark and malevolent. The figure's eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went, and the whispering turned into a constant, oppressive murmur that filled the room with an unsettling presence. Desperate for answers, I researched the history of the mirror. I discovered that it had been part of an estate sale from an old mansion that had been abandoned for decades. The mansion had a dark history, filled with rumors of tragic deaths and mysterious disappearances. The mirror had been sold off after the estate was cleared, but no one seemed to know what had happened to the previous owners or why they had abandoned the mansion. One night, the whispering in the mirror turned into a cacophony of voices. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, a harsh, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the glass. The figure in the reflection became more animated, its ghostly form moving closer to the surface of the mirror as if trying to reach through. I began to lose sleep, my mind plagued by nightmares of dark, shadowy figures and whispering voices. The mirror's presence became a constant source of terror, a reminder of something dark and ancient that was trying to break free. I started seeing the figure not just in the mirror, but in the corners of my vision, always lurking, always watching. On one particularly harrowing night, I could no longer bear the fear. I decided to confront whatever was in the mirror head-on. I stared into the reflection, trying to face the figure that haunted me. The shadowy figure seemed to grow more solid, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. The whispering became a deafening roar, a torrent of voices that filled the room and drowned out all other sound. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed a hammer and smashed the mirror. The glass shattered into countless pieces, each fragment reflecting a distorted version of the room. The cacophony of voices reached a crescendo, and the room seemed to fill with a suffocating darkness. As the last piece of glass fell to the floor, the noise abruptly ceased and the oppressive presence vanished. I was left standing in the wreckage of the mirror, my heart racing and my hands shaking. The room was eerily silent, and the shadowy figure was gone. I quickly gathered the broken pieces and disposed of them, hoping to rid myself of the lingering sense of dread. Since that night, I've done my best to forget the mirror and the horrors it brought into my life. The apartment feels lighter, the shadows less menacing, but the memories of the figure in the glass and the whispering voices remain etched in my mind. I've become wary of antiques and old objects, always wondering what might be lurking within their depths. I've since moved away, leaving the apartment and its dark history behind. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that gaunt figure staring back at me from some unseen corner. The mirror's reflection may be gone, but the echoes of its malevolent presence still haunt my dreams. I backed away, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can be hidden in the most seemed to close in around objects, the shadows lengthening and shifting in the dim light. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to break free from within the walls. Mrs. Jennings moved toward me with an eerie calmness, her eyes never leaving mine. I tried to find another way out, but every door and window seemed to be sealed shut. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the tapping turned into a cacophony of screams and wails. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed a heavy object from a nearby table and smashed the front door's glass panel. I climbed through the shattered opening and ran into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. I sped away from the house, my heart racing and my mind filled with images of the dark figure watching me from the window. I never returned to that house, and I never spoke of it to anyone. The phone was left behind, a haunting reminder of the terror I had experienced. The memories of that night linger, a chilling reminder of the dark forces that seemed to inhabit that old Victorian house. To this day, I avoid small towns and old houses, wary of the shadows that might lie within. The house remains a dark secret, a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur, and where something malevolent waits just beyond the edge of the darkness. Photography has always been my passion. Ever since I was a kid, there's something magical about capturing a fleeting moment, a slice of reality frozen in time, preserved forever in a photograph. I started with an old film camera my dad gave me, and over the years, I upgraded to digital, learning every trick of the trade. Composition, lighting, angles. Photography became more than a hobby. It became an obsession. I especially loved candid shots, people going about their lives, unaware of the camera's lens. I loved the honesty in those photos, the raw emotion. There was something pure about them, something real. Over the years, I built a small portfolio of street photography, and while it never gained much attention, it made me happy. That was enough. But a few months ago, something changed. It started subtly. I'd gone out one day, taking photos around the city, the usual stuff. Crowded streets, kids playing in the park, an elderly couple sitting on a bench. I felt good about the day's work and went home to review the shots on my computer. As I clicked through them, admiring the lighting and composition, I noticed something strange in one of the photos. Behind the elderly couple, there was a dark figure standing near a tree. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a park, after all. People walked through it all the time. But the figure was strange. It wasn't clearly defined, more of a silhouette. The edges were blurred, like it hadn't been caught in focus. No big deal, I thought. Maybe I'd been moving too fast when I took the shot, or maybe the light was playing tricks. I shrugged it off and kept going through the photos. The next image was a shot of a busy street corner. People crossing, cars stopped at a light. But there it was again. The same dark figure standing in the crowd, slightly out of focus, almost like a smudge on the image. I zoomed in, trying to get a better look, but no matter how much I enlarged the picture, I couldn't make out any details. It was just a shadow. A weird coincidence, I thought. Maybe it was someone I'd photographed twice by accident, or perhaps some kind of camera malfunction. But as I clicked through the rest of the images, my stomach tightened with an uneasy realization. The shadow was in every photo. It was always in the background, standing behind a group of people, leaning against a lamppost or partially obscured by trees. But it was there, always slightly out of focus, always just a little too far away to make out clearly. The figure never seemed to be interacting with anyone, just watching. I spent hours scrutinizing each image, looking for an explanation. I thought it might be a smudge on the lens or a problem with the sensor, but no matter how much I cleaned the camera and adjusted the settings, the shadow kept appearing. I even tried taking photos in different locations, but no matter where I went, the shadow followed. It didn't make sense. The figure became an obsession. I stopped taking photos for their beauty or composition. Instead, I became consumed with capturing the shadow, trying to get a clear shot of it. I'd spend hours wandering the streets, snapping pictures of empty sidewalks, deserted parks, and quiet alleyways, hoping to catch it alone, to confront whatever it was that had begun haunting my images. The more I photographed, the more disturbing things became. The shadow began to grow more defined. At first, it had been just a vague, humanoid blur in the background, but as the weeks went on, I could make out more details. The shape of the head, the faint outline of arms and legs. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and its posture was wrong, too rigid, too still. And always it was facing the camera, like it knew I was looking for it. The worst part was no one else could see it. I showed the photos to friends, desperate for someone to acknowledge what I was seeing, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. "There's nothing there," they'd say, scrolling through the images as if they were completely ordinary. "It's just a trick of the light or maybe some digital artifact. Cameras do weird things sometimes." They were trying to be nice, but I could hear it in their voices. They didn't believe me. But I knew what I was seeing. This thing, the shadow, was real. It had to be. I started to feel it outside of the photos, too. When I walked through the city, I could sense it following me, always just out of sight. I'd turn a corner and catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. But when I looked, there was nothing there. I started avoiding crowded places, convinced that it was watching me through the lenses of every phone, every camera I passed. Then one day, I found it in an old photo. I'd been going through some of my older work, stuff I'd taken years ago, before any of this had started. And there it was, the same shadowy figure, standing in the background of a photo I'd taken 3 years earlier. It was blurry, barely noticeable, but it was unmistakable. The same tall, dark silhouette. Panic shot through me. How long had it been there? How many photos had it haunted? I scrolled back through my entire archive, years of photography, and the figure was in almost every single one. Even in my childhood photos, old film prints from family vacations, there it was, always in the background, always watching. Couldn't breathe. This thing had been following me for years, and I hadn't even noticed. How could I not have seen it? How had it been with me all this time? The worst part was the figure was getting closer. In the older photos, it had always been far in the background, almost invisible. But in the more recent shots, it was moving closer to the foreground. In some, it was standing only a few feet behind the subjects, its tall, dark form looming over them, unnoticed. In one particularly chilling photo taken just a week ago, the figure was standing directly behind me, reflected in a shop window. I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped leaving the house. I boarded up the windows, turned off my phone, and disconnected from the internet. I didn't want to see it again. I didn't want to give it any more chances to follow me. But the dreams started soon after. At first, they were fragmented, confusing, just flashes of the shadow standing in the corner of a dark room, watching me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, and find myself staring into the corners of my bedroom, convinced I'd see it there. But it was never there. Not yet. Then the dreams became clearer, more vivid. In the dreams, I was always in a familiar place. A park I used to frequent, a street corner I often passed. I'd be taking photos as usual, but the atmosphere was different. Everything was silent. There were no other people around, no sounds of traffic or birds. Just me, my camera, and the shadow. I would see it out of the corner of my eye, standing just beyond my field of vision, waiting. Every time I turned to look directly at it, it would disappear only to reappear somewhere else, closer, always closer. In one dream, I found myself in the same park where I'd first noticed the shadow in my photos. The trees were dense, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air was heavy with a thick, unnatural stillness. I wandered through the park, my camera clutched tightly in my hands, but the shutter wouldn't click. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't take a photo. The shadow was there, though lurking just behind the trees, waiting for me to notice it. I woke up screaming that night. The image of the shadow burned into my mind. I didn't sleep again after that. Things started disappearing around the house. Small things at first. My keys, a pair of socks, a book I'd been reading. But then it got worse. I'd wake up to find furniture moved, chairs pulled away from the table, cupboard doors left open that I knew I had closed. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, like the shadow was seeping into my reality, creeping closer and closer to where I lived. I tried everything. Cleansing rituals, saging the house, even consulting a psychic. But nothing worked. The figure was always there, always just out of sight, waiting for me to see it again. Then came the final photo. I hadn't touched my camera in weeks, too terrified to see what might appear in the images. But something compelled me. One night, by force I couldn't resist, I picked up the camera, my hands trembling, and snapped a single picture of my bedroom. When I looked at the display, my blood ran cold. The shadow was standing in the middle of the room, just a few feet away from me. It was no longer a vague silhouette. I could see its face now, or what should have been a face. But instead, there was nothing. Just a void, a hollow absence where a face should be. I threw the camera across the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't need to look at the image again. I knew what it meant. The shadow wasn't just following me anymore. It was here in my home, in my life. I haven't taken a photo since. I don't leave the house. I don't look at reflective surfaces. I don't look into the corners of rooms. But it doesn't matter. I can feel it getting closer. It's not just in the photos anymore. It's in me. It was an unusually hot summer when I first laid eyes on the house. The sun hung heavy in the sky, its relentless heat shimmering off the asphalt as I drove through the countryside, looking for a place to escape the constant grind of city life. I had recently inherited a sum of money from a distant relative, and with it, the freedom to make a major life change. When I saw the listing for the house on the hill, I was intrigued. It was described as a large Victorian-style mansion, secluded and surrounded by acres of overgrown land. The photos showed it as grand, yet somewhat dilapidated, but the charm of its old architecture called to me. The drive up to the house was a long, winding path flanked by tall, twisted trees whose branches seemed to claw at the sky. As I arrived, the house loomed ahead, its once majestic facade now covered in ivy and grime. The paint was peeling, and the windows were darkened by layers of dust and neglect. Yet despite its rundown state, there was something undeniably captivating about the house. It felt like stepping into a bygone era, a place where history and mystery intertwined. I moved in quickly, eager to embrace the solitude. The interior was as grand as expected, though in worse shape than the photos had suggested. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the high ceilings. The rooms were filled with old furniture covered in white sheets that seemed to shroud them in a ghostly veil. There was a large fireplace in the living room, its mantel adorned with dusty, faded photographs of people I didn't recognize. The first few nights were peaceful. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak and groan of the old structure settling. I spent my days exploring the grounds and trying to bring some semblance of order to the cluttered interior. I found old letters and journals in the attic, their pages yellowed with age. They told stories of the house's previous inhabitants, revealing little of substance but adding to the sense of the place's deep, unsettling history. It wasn't until the second week that the disturbances began. I started to hear noises, soft whispers and faint footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. At first, I attributed it to the house's natural settling or perhaps the wind playing tricks. But the noises grew more frequent and unnerving. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps approaching my bedroom door, only to find nothing when I opened it. One evening, as I was settling down for bed, I heard a distinct sound coming from the attic. A loud thud followed by what seemed like dragging noises. My heart raced as I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. I climbed up the creaky stairs to the attic, the narrow hallway lit only by the weak beam of my flashlight. The attic was a sprawling space filled with old furniture and dusty trunks. As I scanned the room, I saw that one of the trunks had been moved, its lid slightly ajar. I approached cautiously, my flashlight flickering in the dim light. Inside, I found an assortment of old clothes and personal items, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I noticed something else on the floor, partially hidden under a pile of old newspapers. A small leather-bound book. It was worn and tattered, but it seemed important. I opened it and began to read. The book was a diary, its entries written in a neat, careful hand. The writing was dated from the early 1900s and described the life of a young woman who had lived in the house. Her entries were filled with details of daily life, but as I read further, the tone shifted. The later entries were frantic and disjointed, describing strange occurrences, disembodied voices, eerie shadows, and a growing sense of dread. One entry stood out. "They are here with me. I can hear them whispering, moving in the walls. I tried to leave, but the doors are locked. I don't know how long I can stay. They want something from me, and I fear I know what it is." As I read the final frantic lines, a chill ran down my spine. The diary ended abruptly, with no further explanation. I put the book away and left the attic, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. The noises that night were louder than ever, and I could hear the distinct sound of scratching and dragging coming from the walls. The next day, I decided to investigate the house's history further. I visited the local library and scoured old records, trying to find out more about the previous occupants. I discovered that the house had been the scene of several tragic events over the years: disappearances, unexplained deaths, and rumors of madness. Each account seemed to confirm the growing sense of dread that had settled over me. That night, the disturbances escalated. The whispers turned into full-blown conversations, with voices arguing and screaming in the dark. I could hear doors slamming and furniture being overturned. The house seemed alive with a dark, malevolent energy. Desperate for answers, I went back to the attic and tried to find any clues that might explain what was happening. As I rummaged through the attic, I discovered a hidden compartment behind one of the walls. Inside, I found more personal items: a set of old keys, a lock of hair, and a series of photographs of the same woman from the diary. The photographs showed her in various stages of distress, her eyes wide with fear. The final photograph was the most disturbing. It showed the woman standing in front of the mirror in the attic, her face twisted in terror. Behind her, in the reflection, was a shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, reaching out towards her. The house felt different that night, heavier, more oppressive. I could feel the presence of something dark and angry lurking just out of sight. I tried to sleep, but the whispers and noises kept me awake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure from the photograph, its ghastly face leering at me from the darkness. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. I began to see the figure in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. The house seemed to change. Rooms would shift, doors would lock by themselves, and I would find objects moved or missing. I felt as though I was being watched, trapped in a nightmarish version of reality where the normal rules no longer applied. One night, I was awoken by a loud crash from the attic. The sounds were more violent than ever: screams, shattering glass, and the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever was tormenting me. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I climbed up to the attic. The space was a chaos of broken furniture and shattered glass. The trunk I had found earlier was now open, and the diary was missing. The air was thick with oppressive darkness, and the whispers had turned into a deafening roar. As I moved through the attic, I saw the shadowy figure from the photograph standing in the corner. It was more defined now, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. The figure moved towards me, its mouth opening in a silent scream. I swung the crowbar at it, but it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The figure seemed to grow larger, its presence overwhelming. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed the old keys I had found and unlocked the hidden compartment behind the wall. Inside, I found a hidden door leading down to a small, hidden cellar. The air in the cellar was cold and musty, and the darkness was almost tangible. I descended cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick blackness. The cellar was filled with old, rusted chains and shackles, remnants of a dark past. In the center of the room was a large, iron-bound chest. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a collection of old journals and documents. Among them was a detailed account of the house's history, describing how the previous owner had conducted dark rituals and experiments, trying to summon and control malevolent entities. The final pages of the journal detailed how the owner had become possessed by the very entities they had sought to control. The house had become a prison for these spirits, trapping anyone who entered within its walls. As I read the final entries, I realized that I had become part of the house's dark legacy. The entities had been feeding off my fear and despair, growing stronger with each passing day. The shadowy figure was a manifestation of their power, a malevolent force that would never let go. I fled the cellar, my mind reeling from the revelation. I packed my belongings and left the house behind, never looking back. The sense of relief as I drove away was immense, but the fear and dread lingered. I knew that the house would remain a place of dark memories, a reminder of the malevolent forces that had once held me captive. To this day, I avoid old houses and abandoned places, wary of the darkness that might lie within. The house on the hill remains a haunting memory, a place where the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred, and where something dark and ancient waits for the next unsuspecting soul to wander through its doors. The call came in the middle of the night, as it always does. I had been struggling with insomnia for weeks, my sleep patterns disrupted by nightmares that seemed to seep into reality. The phone's sudden ring was jarring, slicing through the silence of my darkened bedroom. I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. The caller ID showed an unknown number, one that I didn't recognize. I hesitated for a moment, the unsettling feeling that had become a constant companion creeping up my spine. I picked up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. "Hello," I said, trying to mask the weariness in my voice. The line crackled, and for a few seconds, there was only silence. Then a voice began to speak, a voice that was chillingly familiar. "Hi there," the voice said, its tone eerily calm. "I was wondering if you remembered me." I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It belonged to someone I had known years ago, someone I had thought was long gone from my life. It was the voice of Adrian, a friend from my college days who had vanished without a trace. His disappearance had been the subject of much speculation and gossip, but no one had ever discovered what had happened to him. "Adrian," I stammered, disbelief mingling with fear. "Is that really you?" "Yes," the voice replied. "It's me. I need to talk to you." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in shock, my heart pounding. I tried to call back, but the number was disconnected. I sat in the darkness, my mind racing. Was this a prank? Some kind of cruel joke? Or was there something more sinister at play? The next morning, I found myself unable to shake the unease from the night before. I decided to investigate further. I went through old contacts and found Adrian's family. They were as shocked as I was, claiming they hadn't heard from him in years. His parents had moved away, and no one knew where he might be. The sense of dread grew heavier, a weight pressing down on me as I delved into his past. As the days passed, the calls continued. They came at all hours, always from unknown numbers. Each time, the voice on the other end was the same, calm, collected, and hauntingly familiar. Adrian would say a few cryptic words and then hang up, leaving me with a gnawing sense of dread and confusion. The conversations never made sense, but they always left me with a lingering feeling of unease. One evening, after a particularly unsettling call, I noticed something strange. The walls of my apartment seemed to be closing in on me, the rooms feeling smaller and more oppressive. I heard faint, disjointed whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound was maddening, a constant buzz in the back of my mind. That night, the whispers grew louder, and I felt an inexplicable compulsion to follow them. I wandered through my apartment, tracing the sound until it led me to an old, forgotten box I had kept in the back of my closet. It was filled with old photographs, letters, and mementos from years past. As I sifted through the items, I found a photograph of Adrian. He was standing in front of a house that I vaguely recognized, a house I had visited once during college, now long forgotten in the recesses of my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows in my apartment seemed to move and shift, and the whispers grew more frantic. I decided to visit the house from the photograph, hoping to find some clue that would explain the bizarre phone calls and the growing sense of dread. The house was located on the outskirts of town, isolated and overgrown with weeds. It was a dilapidated old place, its paint peeling and windows shattered. The air around it felt heavy, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I hesitated at the entrance, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. Inside, the house was a decaying relic of a past long forgotten. The floors creaked under my weight, and the walls were covered in mold and grime. I moved cautiously through the rooms, each one more derelict than the last. The house seemed to have a life of its own, its very presence suffused with an oppressive sense of malice. I eventually found myself in the basement, a dark, musty space filled with old furniture and broken items. As I explored, I discovered a small door hidden behind a stack of old crates. The door was partially ajar, and an unsettling chill emanated from within. I pushed it open and descended into a narrow, pitch-black tunnel. The tunnel was damp and claustrophobic, the walls lined with old, rotting wood. I followed the passage, my flashlight flickering as I went. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, seeming to come from all directions. My heart raced, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. At the end of the tunnel, I found a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, its legs bound with thick, rusty chains. Next to the chair was a table covered with various objects: photographs, old books, and a single flickering candle. The room was filled with a faint, acrid smell, and the air felt charged with a dark, malevolent energy. On the wall, scrawled in what appeared to be dried blood, were several phrases, disturbing, incoherent messages that seemed to speak of torment and despair. My flashlight revealed more chilling details. A series of photographs pinned to the wall, each showing a person in various stages of distress, their faces twisted in terror. One of the photographs was of Adrian, his eyes wide with fear, a look of pure anguish etched on his face. I felt a sudden, intense cold, and the whispers turned into anguished cries. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pulsating with a dark, suffocating presence. I turned to leave, but the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in a maddening maze. I stumbled out of the tunnel, my mind reeling from the experience. The house felt more oppressive than ever, the darkness closing in around me. I fled the building, the sense of dread following me all the way back to my apartment. The phone calls continued, more urgent and frantic than before, each one leaving me more terrified than the last. Desperate for answers, I sought help from a local paranormal investigator. They examined the house and the tunnel but found no concrete evidence of supernatural activity. They suggested that the disturbances could be the result of my own heightened anxiety and stress. But the investigators' words did little to soothe my growing terror. The phone calls eventually stopped, but the sense of unease never left. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, haunted by the memories of the house and the disturbing revelations I had uncovered. The photographs, the messages on the walls, and the anguished cries. They still lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken hold of my life. In the end, I moved away, leaving behind the apartment and the house on the outskirts of town. But the nightmares persisted, and the feeling of being watched never fully faded. I remained haunted by the calls, the images, and the sense of dread that had taken over my life. The darkness that had once been confined to a decaying house now seemed to follow me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the malevolent force that had once reached out through the phone lines and into my world.